most accounts, the phrase virtual reality was first published in English in 1958 in a book about theater. Anton Artaud coined the phrase in his widely influential text, The Theater and Its Double. Originally published in French in the 1930s, Artaud was describing the relationship of theater to real life as simulation. It should be mentioned that Artaud was a surrealist, so he was particularly adept at crafting paradoxes. Now, I love a good paradox, and I love a good show. Whether it's a Broadway show or a student production, a Hollywood blockbuster or a no-budget indie film, a rock concert or an open mic night, an episode of television or an episode of a web series. As long as it's a good show, I love it. And when I see a good show or a good spectacle, I tell people about it, partly so we could share in the experience of it. And it's not just me. Over the years, I have shared hundreds of films with hundreds of people, and they've shared films with me. We live in a spectacular society, largely mediated by images. And lately, I've been telling people to go see some virtual reality. Now, telling people to go see virtual reality, it's not like telling people to go watch a play or a movie. Telling people to go watch virtual reality is sort of like telling people just to go to the theater, any theater, and go see anything at all, just to get the experience of being there. Now, virtual reality is engulfed in a spectacle, right? Part of the spectacle is watching this new technology just transform, adapt, and pivot right in front of our eyes, literally. We watch as it changes and tries to keep up with our limitless expectations. Every day there's a new article about Google Cardboard or the Oculus Rift, right? Samsung VR, or the PlayStation VR, 360 Heroes, the Litro, the Jaunt, the Jump, Next VR, on and on. And every day, our anticipation keeps growing and growing and growing, along with our uncertainty. And as many of us know, anticipation mingled with uncertainty makes for a good story, right? It makes for a good show. Who doesn't love a good show? So the subtitle of my speech comes from the book Simulacra and Simulation. And it was written by philosopher Jean Baudrillard. But I took this title optimistically. In his 1981 text about mass reproduction and electronic media culture, Baudrillard coined the term hyper-reality in 1981. In our world, reality and fiction intertwine seamlessly. The map comes before the territory, and the signifiers become what's signified. In a world bereft of meaning, lacking any consequence, all that's left is the virtual. So virtual reality is something that I grew up with. Most of us probably have grown up with it, hearing about it all of our lives, right? It's something that I read about pretty much mostly in fiction, right? Movies and books, stories. And that's pretty much where I learned how to think about virtual reality. And I never put a headset on, never put on a haptic glove, never put on a haptic suit. And who needs a haptic suit when you have movies like Lawnmower Man or the novels like Ready Player One? If you haven't read it, you should read it. As a culture, we've been hyping up this technology for 50 years, right? We're just building our anticipation. It's the stuff of science fiction. And now it's actually very nearly here, right? And it's coming through to mass media on cell phones, on our smartphones. So what does this actually mean for theater? What does affordable virtual reality equipment mean for theater? Well, virtual reality is a stage. It's both a figurative stage in the long procession of theater history. It's also a virtual stage for performance. It's an empty space where theater can occur. To crudely adapt Peter Brook, a virtual man walks across an empty virtual space while someone else is watching, and that's all that's needed for an act of theater to be engaged. Now, theater has a long history of evolving and adapting technology for thousands of years. Theater has absorbed all kinds of architecture, mechanical engineering. Theater has taken light, recorded sound, made them characters on stage. Almost immediately after their invention, photography and film projection made it on stage. In recent years, video projection, interconnectivity have become part of the essential language of theater. Technology and theater are bound together. But if theater is defined by presence, by the live performer in the same space as the live audience, and virtual reality is defined by isolation, by the lone audience member trapped in a headset somewhere far away, what happens when we combine the two? This combination of live theater as we know it and virtual reality as we think it might be, as it's been shown to us in the media, might not seem like an immediate fit. And that's because it's actually not a proper representation. When virtual reality is working, it creates the feeling of presence. We cross the threshold from isolation into engagement. Our brain says, this is real. And that feeling of an actual experience happening occurs. Well, technologists have been in pursuit of this level of engagement for decades. And arguably, storytellers have been engaging in narrative as virtual reality for forever, since time began. And yet, new forms demand new formulas, right? In the absence of meaning in a virtual reality, signification itself takes precedence, and performance turns into symbols. So as the tools of virtual reality creation become increasingly available to artists, vital questions emerge, right? Will virtual reality revolutionize live performance? Or will the same shows and the same practices just get repackaged over and over and over again? Performance artists have been working with mediated liveness for decades now. So these questions aren't necessarily new, but they need to evolve. And the reason these questions need to evolve is because a new audience of millions of people is actually finally coming online. After 50 years of promise, now that we have virtual reality coming to our cell phones, we need to ask the question, is the potential of the virtual spectator greater than the potential of a live audience seated in a theater? When a virtual reality show is live streamed to a decentralized audience, the experience should be individualized, right? It should be curated. A bland, homogeneous virtual reality experience defeats the purpose of virtual reality, denies the potential. So the creators of live virtual reality shows, they need to do the work, and so do the viewers. They need to do the work of experiential curation, right? Users and creators, they must have options available, and the options must be clear. When virtual reality feels strictly like being in a seat, only able to pivot on one axis, the experience fails. Even in a real theater, you're able to move around a little bit, shift, maybe change seats, maybe get up and go to the lobby. So yes, I'm suggesting virtual theater performances should have virtual lobbies and virtual bathrooms you could get up and go and actually experience in the middle of a performance. You shouldn't be trapped in some virtual theater of captivity. So virtual reality comes with this new politics of perception, right? The audience should be set free to participate, and they should be able to participate in the experience to determine their own point of view in an almost metaphysical fashion. Now, the individual audience member should be able to shift perspective throughout the performance. A single camera is not sufficient, and it's really just one intermission might just be possibly oppressive. Now, the virtual audience members ought to be given free rein to move around the virtual space, and the live performers ought to know where the audience is. Placing a 180-degree camera or a 360-degree camera at the edge of a stage near the action is not enough. That's actually more restrictive than it is creative. For anyone who's ever experienced it, you're very much trapped. You're paralyzed, worse than you would be if you're just watching an edited show that has been shot from a single camera angle. But with movement comes problems. And movement is one of the biggest problems that's talked about in virtual reality, for any of you who've read about it. You get this feeling of seasickness. Now, when people start using virtual reality, they can only do it for a few minutes at a time. The nausea you feel in virtual reality is very much like the nausea you'd feel in real life. It's when your perceptions don't match your expectations. You feel ill. But once we get used to the experience in virtual reality, the nausea subsides, and it can become an incredibly comfortable experience as an audience member. However, there is still the potential for anxiety. The anxiety of being trapped in a single place, pivoting on a single axis, incapable of getting any closer or any farther away from a virtual event. The more you use virtual reality, the more the human instinct for interaction strengthens and grows. The experience of looking at a static 360 virtual reality photograph gives way to wanting to look at 360-degree videos, and that gives way to wanting to be able to move through those videos. So what becomes essential is some kind of control, having some kind of controller involved. So the big concern here is the audience. The audience is going to need to use this technology to develop a relationship with performances. Developers of the new technology, they often find that what they actually intended is not what the audience wanted. And audiences often hack the material, hack the technology, and reinvent it. Some of you may have heard about the Xbox Kinect being a great example of this, where people got it and they decided to just use it for totally different purposes. Luckily, Microsoft, they went along with it. So this brings up more questions about affordable virtual reality technology and how mass market VR can be integrated into theater, or how it can become theater. I think virtual reality can supplant traditional theatrical experiences for contemporary audiences if the technology is widely adopted and easily accessible. Broadcasting to decentralized audiences is nothing new. We've been broadcasting to people via television and radio and the internet for decades now, right? The question is, if the virtual reality headset and controller can merge with theater to create the experience of remote, embodied liveness between the performer and the audience. Now, the use of virtual reality headsets and controllers within traditional theatrical settings also has great potential. Believe it or not, there is actually something about wearing a headset in a large group of people and actually being isolated, being part of a collective performance, and being more engaged with it. Now, compared to theater, virtual reality is still in its infancy, and yet virtual reality and theater are each other's double. Combining the virtually real and the really virtual creates the potential for a double paradox of live virtual reality theater. And I love a good paradox. And real or virtual, I love a good show. Thank you.